We're recording now. I won't repeat what I just said. um, he's a professor of law at George Mason University. He holds an MA in political science from Harvard and a JD from Yale. He's published too many articles to name and several books. He's the author of Democracy and Political Ignorance, Why Smaller Government is Smarter, The Grasping Hand, Kelo v. City of New London and the Limits of Eminent Domain. First book is from Stanford, second book is from Chicago. A co-authored work, A Conspiracy Against Obamacare, the Volk, how do you pronounce that name, Professor? Volk Conspiracy. I know the blog and the healthcare case. And he's here tonight to talk to us about his most recent book, Free to Move: Foot Voting, Migration, and Political Freedom. There's some really eloquent pages in Free to Move where Professor Somin notes that he was born in 1973 to a Jewish family in the Soviet Union. And so obviously, you know, the movement and freedom are themes in his work. He's a great scholar of federalism and decentralizing political authority. He's a great scholar of freedom and markets, relationship between markets and freedom. And he can't be easily pigeonholed right to left. I recall using work that he did when I was arguing for my local community to become a sanctuary jurisdiction for unauthorized migrants, and his arguments were about federalism, but they were clear and powerful. And I can't say that I've read the whole book, but I'm working my way through it. And I usually hold up the physical copy, but I don't know how the electric copy will play on screen. I don't know.
This is the physical copy if people want to see it.
There you go. Thank you. That's great. Oxford University Press. I highly recommend it. Professor Somin writes with great elegance and style, just illuminating writing. It's just a pleasure to be reading this book. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. And a couple of ground rules. The talk would be roughly 30 to 40 minutes. You can go on a little longer if you'd like. Then we'll have 15 or 20 minutes for Q&A. Please put your questions in the chat and I'll field them and screen them. We're sponsored tonight by the Office of the Dean of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I particularly always want to do this. I want to thank Rashenda Kramer for joining us and for being such a great help in doing what we do to try to help our students. And I want to acknowledge and recognize my colleague Mark White, who also writes, is also prolific and writes with great style and grace. So Professor Somin, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. For those interested, the book is available in both hard copy and ebook, and there's actually an audio version as well. They're all available on Amazon and lots of other locations on the web for those who may be interested. And actually, I have committed that 50% of all royalties generated by this book in all of its forms will go to causes benefiting refugees, who sadly in the pandemic are even worse off than refugees are in more normal times. So I'm going to now share my PowerPoint presentation if I can, and hopefully won't encounter technical difficulties with that. I assume you can now all see my screen. This is the cover of the book. It was published just last year by Oxford University Press. Ironically, I published a book on the importance of freedom of movement right as most of the world was going into lockdown. So that obviously, in one sense, wasn't so great for the rollout of the book. But I hope that the experience of the last year, as awful as it was in so many ways, might have a very small silver lining. It might get more of us to appreciate the importance of the freedom of movement, which we were denied, and to also think about those many millions of people around the world who are essentially in lockdown, even in normal times, in the sense that they're on a regular basis trapped in locations where they're essentially doomed to poverty or oppression unless they have the opportunity to leave. So in this book, I talk about 3 different types of voting with your feet as a mechanism of political choice. One is voting with your feet in federal systems, where you choose where to live based in part on government policies, like in a different state or a local government. Another is foot voting in the private sector, which is, I think, is a less familiar concept than voting with your feet in federal systems, but I will suggest it's still extremely important and an underestimated mode of political choice. Finally, we'll talk about foot voting through international migration, which is the most controversial type, but I will also suggest that it's the one that has the greatest potential gains. And in the last part of the presentation, I'll go through some standard objections to expanding foot voting opportunities and explain why I think many of those objections are either just wrong or greatly overblown. And first things first, however, we want to ask, why would we even talk about voting with your feet as a mode of political choice, given that it seems like we already have the ability to choose what government policies we want to live under at the ballot box, like, for example, in the presidential election just last November, and in many other elections at the state or local level, and elections for other federal offices and so forth. And I think definitely ballot box voting is extremely important, and it's much preferable to dictatorship or oligarchy. However, it does have two very serious limitations. One is that when you vote at the ballot box, the chance that your vote will actually make a difference to the outcome is extremely small. In an American presidential election like the one we just had, it's roughly 1 in 60 million. If you live in a swing state, it could be considerably higher than that, maybe even as high as 1 in 1 million. On the other hand, if you live in a state like New York, which is the very opposite of a swing state in that it's virtually never in doubt in recent presidential elections, then your chances are even much lower than the 1 in 60 million, perhaps 1 in several hundred million. Obviously, your odds are greater in state elections or local elections, but except in the very tiniest jurisdictions, there's still just one chance in many thousands or one chance in several million or the like. In most contexts, we would not say that you have meaningful freedom or meaningful freedom of choice in a situation where you only have a 1 in 1 million chance of actually making a difference to the outcome. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of religion in a world where you have only a 1 in a million chance of being able to determine what faith you want to practice. We wouldn't say you have meaningful freedom of speech if you have only a 1 in 1 million or 1 in 60 million chance of being able to decide what opinions you're allowed to express. And I would suggest the same thing is true of political freedom. You have very little, if any, real political freedom if you only have a 1 in 60 million or even a 1 in 1 million chance of deciding what policies you're actually going to live under. This leads to a second weakness of ballot box voting, which is that precisely because the odds of making a difference are so extraordinarily low, most people have very little incentive to acquire much in the way of knowledge about the issues that they're voting on. And in fact, both in this book and in my previous book, Democracy and Political Ignorance, I go through a good deal of evidence which shows that the vast majority of voters actually know very little about the issues they're voting on. They don't even know, in many cases, basic structural aspects of the political system. For example, only about a third of Americans can even name the 3 branches of the federal government: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. Similarly, most do not know how the federal government spends its money. They often don't know things like which government officials are responsible for which issues. And if you don't know what the government's policies actually are, or even which officials control which ones, it's very hard to hold them accountable at the ballot box. The American Medical Association says that before a doctor can operate on you or really treat you in almost any way, he or she has to get your informed consent. That is, before they can treat you, they have to know that you are aware of what they're going to do and what its likely effects are. Obviously, government policy, much like medical treatment, is often literally a matter of life and death. That's obviously been true during the COVID pandemic, but for a variety of issues, it's true even during normal times. And yet, but most of the time, democratic government is like a doctor whose treatments you are not allowed to refuse. And most of the patients don't even know enough to be able to tell whether the treatments are actually likely to work or whether they are in fact snake oil. On both of these dimensions, Foot voting has important advantages over ballot box voting. When you vote with your feet in a federal system or in the private sector or through international migration, if you're allowed to do so, those are decisions that are highly likely to make a difference. It's not a 1 in 60 million chance or a 1 in 1 million chance. In many cases, it's actually 1 chance in 1. Or if you have a family, maybe obviously you have to share influence with your spouse or other family members, but at least it's 1 chance in 2 or 1 chance in 3 or some other relatively high number, as opposed to 1 in 1 million chance that you have at the ballot box, or even a smaller chance than that. For that very reason, foot voters also have better incentives to seek out information and use it wisely than ballot box voters do. If you're like most people, you probably spent more time and effort seeking out relevant information the last time you decided which television set to buy than the last time you decided who to vote for president or for any other political office. That's not because your TV deals with more important or more complicated issues than the president does. It's because when you choose what TV to buy, you know that that thing will probably actually end up in your living room and you'll get to watch it. But when you flip on the TV and you have the misfortune to see the president or some other important politician, you know that your chance of affecting who that is infinitesimally small. So as a result, quite understandably, you take the TV decision much more seriously than you take the decision on who to vote for president. And the same thing is true for other kinds of foot voting decisions compared to ballot box voting decisions. Both common sense and lots of social science research shows that people making foot voting decisions tend to be much better informed than those making ballot box voting decisions. In the book, I discuss how these advantages of foot voting over ballot box voting translate into important advantages under a wide range of different theories of political freedom. I'm a libertarian myself. I think I'm totally open about that. But there's nothing specifically libertarian about the premises on which this argument rests. As I discuss in the book, you can reach the same conclusions by using the frameworks of leading political theorists in the liberal tradition, people on the left, in the center, and on the right, and people who really aren't very libertarian at all. So you can accept the fact that foot voting has these important advantages, even if you don't accept any specific libertarian premises, or indeed, even if you don't tie yourself to any one very specific theory of political freedom at all. It turns out these advantages matter under a wide range of different theories, and I'm happy to talk in more detail about specific theories in the questions. But for now, I'd like to focus in more detail on the particular types of foot voting discussed in the book. And the first is foot voting under federalism, which I think is the kind that we most readily think of when we hear a phrase of voting with your feet. And it is indeed the case that foot voting under federalism can offer a wide range of political choice to many people. In the United States, we have 50 state governments and almost 90,000 local governments. And that offers a wide range of options, much more than voting for one out of two parties in a national election, and it offers a range of different mixes of public policies that people might prefer to live under. Moreover, as discussed more fully in the book, foot voting under federalism is something that throughout American history and also in the history of many other federal systems has been a special boon to the poor and the disadvantaged, that they can move to places where there are better job opportunities, they face less discrimination, and so on. A famous historical example is the movement of African Americans away from the South to the North and the West during the Great Migration of the early 20th century. But there are many other examples, and I'm happy to talk about them more if people have questions about them. Today, also, foot voting through internal freedom of movement in the federal system can also benefit the poor in a variety of ways. All of this can occur even in the absence of any competitive pressure. That is, even if states and localities are not deliberately trying to attract people, but obviously things can be better if there is competition. That is, if state and local governments are actively trying to attract potential foot voters and to give those people who are already there incentives to want to stay. And in the book, I discuss a number of strategies for enhancing competition and for giving state and local governments greater incentives to engage in it. Obviously, particularly in recent decades, a number of obstacles to foot voting have arisen and continue to exist. Among the biggest is exclusionary zoning, which artificially increases the cost of housing and makes it difficult or impossible in some places, including, sad to say, in New York City. It makes it difficult or impossible to build new housing in response to demand. There are a number of other obstacles to effective foot voting as well within federal systems, and I discuss ways to alleviate them in the book. Similarly, there are, of course, moving costs, which can be a problem. Moving within a federal system is not free. But as I also explained in the book, very often the benefits are still more than worth it, given the differences between jurisdictions. And there are ways to reduce moving costs, for example, by decentralizing power to lower levels of government. As a general rule, it is cheaper to move from one town to another in the same region than, say, to move to another state or particularly to one that's on the other side of the country. We cannot completely eliminate these obstacles to foot voting under federalism, but we can reduce them and thereby empower many more people to take advantage of these opportunities than is currently the case. The next kind of foot voting I'm going to focus on is one that is less familiar, and that is foot voting in the private sector. But even though many people don't think of this as voting with your feet, in fact, there are private sector institutions that offer many of the same kinds of goods and services as those we traditionally associate with state or local governments. The biggest example is private planned communities like homeowners associations, condominiums, and many others. Almost 70 million Americans already live in these kinds of communities, and they offer a wide range of different options and different services. And potentially the range of options is even greater than what you can get within a federal system, because in a given area, you can usually have more private planned communities than you can state or local governments or governmental authorities of any kind. Moreover, data consistently show that the services provided by these kinds of private planned communities often are better quality than similar services provided by state and local governments, so you get enhanced choice on that dimension as well. The standard criticism of foot voting in the private sector, and especially of private planned communities, is that really this is only something that the wealthy can do. And in addition, it's even said, well, this is just the wealthy walling themselves off from the rest of society, isolating themselves and leaving the poor to fend for them on their own. But in reality, it's pretty clear that it is simply not the case that this is only for the wealthy. The fact that we already have almost 70 million Americans already living in this form of social organization, unless you believe we have 70 million super wealthy people, it just isn't true that it's only for the rich. However, I do recognize that under current policies, it is more difficult in many places for the poor and sometimes even for the lower middle class to avail themselves of these sorts of opportunities than it is for those who are higher up on the socioeconomic scale. And in the book, I propose various reforms that would make this form of foot voting more available to more people. And I would add that private planned communities are only the most striking of many examples of private sector foot voting. There's a wide range of other situations where people can use private institutions to substitute in various ways for government services. Private school choice is an excellent example, and there are others as well. It is not my claim that private sector foot voting can completely displace the functions of state or local governments. For that matter, I also do not claim that state and local governments can completely displace the federal government. However, many different policies and activities of government can be decentralized to lower levels, such as states or localities, or in some cases to the private sector. And we can do that to a greater extent than is the case today. If you believe that, say, small European countries like Denmark or Switzerland operate reasonably fine on their own and can have their own autonomous healthcare policies or education policies or pension policies, then the same thing is surely true of American states or even some American cities which are as large or in some cases much larger than many of these small European countries are. So there's a lot of room for improvement here, even though there will always be some issues that are so large they can only be handled by the national government, or in extreme cases like global warming, perhaps only through some kind of international arrangement. The most controversial type of voting is, of course, through international migration. And as you all probably know, international migration has been highly controversial in recent American politics, but also in Western Europe and elsewhere. Despite the controversy, this nonetheless is the area where there are the greatest potential gains. The reason is that the differences between countries in terms of quality of government are so much larger than any differences that you can find between jurisdictions within a federal system within the United States or anywhere else. Think of whatever you believe is the best governed American state and compare it to whatever you think is the worst. It's probably a big difference, but it's nothing or very small compared to the difference between the US and Cuba or the US and Syria. People escaping totalitarian communism in Cuba, or people escaping the brutal regime that governs Syria, or similar governments in many other countries, if they manage to flee to a liberal democratic society that has greater freedom and greater opportunity, they can massively transform their lives along every conceivable dimension. They obviously have greater political freedom, but they have greater freedom of almost every other kind as well. Think of women fleeing patriarchal societies like Saudi Arabia, religious and ethnic minorities fleeing repression, political dissidents fleeing persecution based on their views, and many, many other examples like this. If they are able to get to a liberal democracy, then they can right away massively improve their lives in every conceivable way. In addition to these gains in terms of various kinds of freedom, there is also an enormous economic gain to be had, in that economists estimate that if we had free migration throughout the world GDP would double. That is, we would produce twice as much wealth as we currently do. How could this be? The reason is that there are so many millions of people trapped in societies where the government is corrupt, oppressive, or otherwise dysfunctional to such an extent that no matter how smart those people are, no matter how hard they work, they have little or no chance of ever becoming productive or ever escaping poverty. If they cross over to the United States or to some other advanced liberal democracy, they can almost immediately double or triple their incomes by doubling or tripling their productivity. And that doesn't take account of the fact that over time, they can improve their skills and become more productive. And obviously, opportunities to improve your skills are more readily available in the US or in Canada or in Western Europe or other similar countries than they are in the countries which these people are fleeing. I would add one final point to the benefits of international migration, and that is that foot voting through immigration is the only realistic mode of political choice available to the roughly 1/3 of the world's population who lives under dictatorships, and therefore they don't even have the very limited political freedom that we have at the ballot box. Despite these truly enormous gains, there obviously are a wide range of objections to expanding freedom of choice or freedom of movement through international migration. And in the book, I divide those into two categories. One is a set of arguments which say that governments have a general right to exclude potential migrants. They don't even necessarily have to have any particularly good reason. It's just if they want to exclude people, they can. There's a second set of arguments which says maybe there isn't a general right to exclude, but often we have to exclude people to avoid various kinds of problems, such as overburdening the welfare state, increasing crime, harming the political system, and so on. So I'll first turn to the arguments which claim that there is a general right to exclude foreigners from coming in. And perhaps the most common form of argument of that type is the kind that you see on the screen right now. This is a French nationalist poster. It says, "La France aux Français," France for the French. The idea here is that the true owners of France are the ethnic Frenchmen and French women And therefore, the French government, if it wants to, it can exclude people from other ethnic or racial backgrounds. It can exclude Germans, Italians, Japanese, and so forth. And similarly, just as you can say France is for the French, so Germany is for the Germans, Russia is for the Russians, Italy is for the Italians, and so on. And this is a very commonly made argument to justify migration restrictions. One flaw with this sort of argument is that if you look at the history of almost every country in the world, it's really hard to trace it to a point where there was only one ethnic or cultural group there and everybody else is somehow an interloper. In reality, virtually every part of the world has had significant ethnic or cultural diversity for a long time. And to the extent that one group has become the majority or become dominant, often it's through conquest or oppression. And therefore, it's very hard to argue on the basis of the bad behavior of other members of the same ethnic group years ago, that now that group has the unique right to own France or own Germany or some other part of the world. In the United States, this form of argument is particularly problematic because if you take it seriously, the group with the best claim to be the true owners of America may be the Native Americans. So perhaps if you buy into this theory, they would have the right to expel all of the rest of us, leaving only themselves. This may be why you don't so often hear this argument in the US, though it is often brought up in many other countries. But even setting aside these kinds of historical difficulties, the argument is badly flawed in its own terms. Because if you take it seriously, it's a rationale for ethnic and racial discrimination. In virtually every other context, we say that there should be a very strong presumption against discrimination on the basis of race or ethnicity. As Martin Luther King famously said, we should judge people on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. Why? Because whether you're black or white, or whether you're English or French, it's something that you can't control. It just depends on who your parents were. And also, it's not something that doesn't tell anything about your moral worth or how much freedom you should be entitled to. That's why today we almost universally condemn the long and shameful history of racial segregation in the United States. We condemn similar policies in other countries, such as South African apartheid, and other situations that have arisen historically where internally governments have engaged in racial and ethnic discrimination, particularly where they have said that where people are allowed to live and work should depend on what racial or ethnic group they belong to. All of these objections that are raised against internal racial and ethnic discrimination, they apply to the international kind just as readily. That the fact that it's an international border doesn't somehow make it really morally important that you're white or black or that you're French or German by ancestry. It's still something you can't control. It's still something that's morally arbitrary, and it's still something that has nothing to do with what kind of a person you are or how much freedom you should be allowed to have. And this same problem actually infects not just racially or ethnic-based restrictions on where people can migrate to, but also the even more common restrictions which are based on who your parents are or where you were born. So in the US, at least in recent years, we for the most part don't have specifically ethnic and racial restrictions on immigration, but the immigration system does work on the basis of parentage and place of birth, namely that if you're a U.S. citizen or if your parents were U.S. citizens, then you can move around in the U.S. freely and live there if you want, or if you were born on U.S. territory, you can. But if you were born in the wrong place to the wrong parents, then you're largely out of luck. You can only come in if the US government gives you special permission to do so. And for the majority of people who want to come in, that permission is not forthcoming. We readily condemn this sort of arrangement today when it was practiced in the system that's now up on the board, that this is the feudal system of medieval Europe, where whether you could move around freely or not depended on whether you were a noble or a serf. If you were a noble, you could, for the most part at least, live where you wanted. On the other hand, if you were a serf, you were out of luck. You were only allowed to move around if the nobles gave you special permission to do so. And what determines whether you're a noble or a serf in this system? Well, it's based on your parentage. If you made the great decision to choose noble parents, then you can move freely. On the other hand, if you chose to be the son or daughter of a serf, then you're tied to the land where you are. And of course, we readily condemn this today. It's not hard to see why it's morally wrong. But sadly, this very same kind of system that we have rejected for several hundred years now, domestically, it is replicated at the international level. Where if you have the good fortune to be born to parents who are citizens of among the more advanced nations in the world, you can to a large extent at least live where you want. On the other hand, if you're born in the wrong place, the wrong parents, then you're much like a serf in the sense that you may well be trapped your entire life in poverty or oppression. If this was wrong in medieval feudalism, I would say that it's equally wrong today. And while many people don't think of it in those terms, structurally the two systems work in very similar ways. Now, in the United States, we less often hear the ethnically based argument for excluding people, and more often you hear an argument like this one, that the United States or other nations, they can be analogized to owners of a private house or members of a club. And the owner of a house can exclude people without necessarily having a good reason for doing so. And similarly, members of a private club, they can exclude others as well. And again, they don't necessarily have to have a good reason. For instance, I can establish a club with my fellow baseball fans, and I can say fans of other sports need not apply, or just people who don't like sports in general. They can't be members either. It's not because people who like other sports are worse than baseball fans, or that we think that they'll do bad things if they join the club. It's just we only want baseball fans, and that's a good enough reason to give us the right to exclude. So similarly, if the United States is like a house or like a club, then it can exclude people as much as it wants to and doesn't necessarily have to have a good reason. This argument or this analogy, despite its popularity, has many flaws. I go through a lot of them in the book. Here I will focus on just one really big one. If you take it seriously, then it has dire implications, not just for immigrants, but also for natives. Consider that the owner of a private house or the members of a club, they can set rules on all sorts of things. I, for instance, can say the only religion that can be practiced in my house is the one that I like, Christianity or Islam or what have you. Similarly, I could have a Christian or a Muslim club. Only Christians are allowed to join. Only Muslims are allowed to join, and so forth. And you can say the same thing about freedom of speech. I can say in my house, I will only allow pro-Republican political speech, or only speech that favors the Democratic Party. And of course, you can have a Republican club or a Democratic club, and such things very much exist. And so if you really believe that the powers of governments are analogous to those of homeowners or those of private club members, then you're essentially justifying what is close to a totalitarian state that is allowed to control almost every aspect of the lives of the people living on its territory, or perhaps even just entering its territory for so long as they stay there. And I think for that reason alone, this kind of analogy should be rejected, even though a lot of people make it on a regular basis, often perhaps without thinking about its implications. Even if you reject the idea that there is a general right to exclude migrants, still often people argue that we have to exclude people or exclude many categories of migrants in order to avoid specific types of problems. Examples include overburdening the welfare state, increasing crime and terrorism. Many argue that if the wrong kind of immigrants come in, they might vote in elections and vote for terrible candidates. If you're not careful, if you let in too many of the wrong kinds of people, you might even elect a president. I know this is hard to believe, but you might even elect a president who has no regard for liberal democratic values whatsoever, who constantly says horrible authoritarian things on Twitter and elsewhere, and may not even accept a peaceful transition of power if he loses an election. Such things can potentially happen. And despite my jokes about it, I think such issues have to be taken seriously. And in the book that I go over a bunch of issues of this sort. Here, I'll just outline my general framework for how I think they should be addressed. And it's a 3-step process. The first question to ask is, how big is this problem really? And in many cases, it turns out that the answer is that it's either non-existent or it's relatively insignificant. So for example, the data do not show that immigrants overburden the welfare state. American jurisdictions with more immigrants do not have higher per capita welfare spending than those with less. And the same is true when you compare different European countries to each other. Indeed, the overwhelming majority of immigrants are actually net contributors to the government budget. The same thing is true for crime. Far from increasing our crime rate, immigrants, including undocumented immigrants, actually have substantially lower crime rates than native-born Americans do. So they're actually lowering the crime rate rather than increasing it. However, in some cases, it could be that there really is a problem. Then I would say, let's go to the second step of the analysis and ask, is there a keyhole solution? That is there a way to address this problem without actually excluding people? And very often the answer is yes. Let's say you worry, despite the data, that immigrants really will overburden the welfare state. If so, there's a simple keyhole solution. Make them ineligible for whatever types of welfare benefits you think might be undermined, or cap the amount that they're allowed to get. And we, in fact, already do this under the 1996 Welfare Reform Act. Similarly, if you believe that immigrants will be bad voters or that risk exists, you can do, again, more of what we do already. It is already the case that immigrants cannot become citizens and vote until they've been in the US for at least 5 years. And even then, they must pass a civics test that most native-born Americans would fail. In principle, you could make the 5-year period longer, you could make the civics test harder, and so forth. And there are similar keyhole solutions for a wide range of other problems that are commonly raised as concerns about immigration, such as crime, terrorism, spreading potentially harmful cultural values, and so forth. But let's say you come up with a problem that is real and there isn't an obvious keyhole solution, at least not one that seems likely to be feasible. Still, there's yet a third stage of the analysis that you should go through before concluding that migration restrictions are justified, and that is to ask, can we use some of the vast wealth generated by migration to alleviate potential negative side effects? As I mentioned before, free migration throughout the world would generate enormous additional wealth. And to the extent that migration has negative side effects, we can tap some of that wealth to alleviate them. For example, let's say you worry that some types of native-born workers will be displaced by immigrant workers or their wages will be lowered. The data on this is actually very mixed and suggests that such effects are extremely limited. But let's say you worry about them and you think it is morally wrong to displace native-born workers in this way. If so, there is a way you can tap the wealth to address this. Simply tax some of the wealth created by immigration and use it as wage subsidies for any category of native-born workers that you believe deserve them. We already actually have a system of wage subsidies through the Earned Income Tax Credit in the United States. You can expand that for whatever category of workers you think it's necessary to do it. And there are similar tapping the wealth approaches that can be used for a range of other problems. I go into them in the book. The book, of course, was published and written before the COVID crisis, but nonetheless, I think my 3-step framework works well for problems of this type as well. I've written about this in more recent publications, such as an article in The Atlantic and another in Regulatory Review, that you should first ask, are migration restrictions actually effective in stopping the spread of contagious disease? And the data on this is very mixed at best. It's not at all clear that they really are. But let's assume that they can stop the spread, or at least in some cases, such as COVID-19, maybe they can. If so, there is a good keyhole solution. And that is simply adopt a 10 or 14-day quarantine of the sort actually already used by some nations like South Korea, which has handled the pandemic much better than the United States has, certainly. If the immigrants quarantine for 10 days or 14 days after first coming in, that's enough to ensure that either they don't have the disease or that they're no longer contagious. And that's much cheaper and less cruel, and produces more economic growth and wealth than excluding people entirely. It's also even a more effective way of stopping the spread of disease, because if you try to keep out migrants entirely, you almost inevitably generate undocumented or illegal immigration. And when you have a population of undocumented immigrants, they have strong incentives to avoid testing for the disease. If they come to the attention of the authorities, they could get deported. And similarly, we're now facing the problem that some might be afraid to get vaccinated because, again, they might come to the attention of the authorities. And even under the new administration, which is less likely to deport them than the Trump administration was, there is still some chance that it would happen, and someone might understandably be scared of that. I would add that our immigration detention facilities, where we keep people for many months on end, those have been shown to be very unsanitary in many ways, and they too help spread diseases, including COVID, including sometimes the surrounding community, as well as to the detained immigrants themselves. We wouldn't need immigration detention if we had a rule of freedom of movement combined with temporary quarantines that last for only a few days, if assuming that was actually necessary. I would add also that in the long run, the wealth generated by additional migration and also the scientific innovation that it helps promote actually make us healthier and safer in the long run. Immigrants are disproportionate contributors to medical care and scientific innovation in the United States and also in other countries. If you look at both of the first two COVID vaccines authorized in the US, immigrants from poor and oppressive societies played major roles in developing both the Moderna vaccine and the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine. I go through some of the details in an article in Regulatory Review that I published a couple months ago. Obviously, those people were able to migrate and help us fight the pandemic, but our immigration restrictions probably keep out thousands of other people who could have made major contributions to fighting disease and other medical and scientific innovations as well. Much more can be said, but I will end on one last point, which is that virtually all of the justifications that I have gone through that might justify restricting international migration, if you take them seriously and apply them consistently, they would also justify severe restrictions on internal migration as well. If the United States is like a club that can exclude immigrants from abroad, why can't Texas be a club that excludes migrants from California? If you believe that it's justifiable to exclude people because they might overburden the welfare state or compete for jobs, then obviously internal migrants can do that too. If people migrate from poorer states to wealthier states, they might burden the wealthier states' social welfare system. They might compete for jobs. They also might have higher crime rates potentially than natives of the wealthier state, and so on. And I can make similar points about pretty much every other rationale that has been put forward. So ultimately, if you're worried of justifying internal migration restrictions on that basis, then you should apply your skepticism to the international kind as well. So on that note, I conclude, but I very much look forward to the questions.
Thank you so much. That was so fascinating. Just really appreciative of that. Folks, if you have questions, put them in the chat, type them in the chat, and I'll try to field them and pass them on to the author, our speaker. And just to give you some time to do that, I guess I'll start. I don't have a very well-formulated question, but I'm going to try two. One is and this may be related, and I didn't get to this part in the book, so I'm sorry, but I'm wondering, you didn't mention the sort of race to the bottom issue, and that would give rise to some thinking about sort of the balance of federal uniformity and state autonomy to go their separate ways. But all the incentive structures of state to state migration really are, well, they're problematic for this reason. And it's the national government that has the resources to sort of gather up our collective will and do things. So that's one question. And the second question is just, I'm in political science, and I don't know if this is fair or not. I'll just say it. I'm reminded of reading Bruce Ackerman's work, which is, he's brilliant, and as you know, and full of great ideas. But I've always thought, yeah, but how's this gonna happen? Like where's the analysis of power and political process and change that would give us something like, an emergency constitutional framework? And I'm thinking that basically you are rattling our cage. We don't usually think about movement and political freedom in all the ways you've elaborated. But if one starts thinking about who has an incentive to go for this, who has an incentive to, worry about these rules, I don't know. It gets a little more. I think there are political interests at stake that have to be overcome in some of these instances.
So two good questions. It's interesting that you bring up Bruce Ackerman, because I was Bruce Ackerman's research assistant for 1.5 years when I was in law school, though I should mention Bruce and I have very different views on many issues. We do have somewhat similar views on international migration, but probably not on the internal kind, which is sort of ironic, whereas by contrast, with some of my more conservative friends, they're like, yeah, internal freedom of movement is great, so it's great that people can move to Texas from California and take advantage of Texas' greater freedom. But if it's Mexicans trying to move to Texas, that's terrible. We can't have that. But I'll answer your questions in the reverse order that you posed them. Both answers are actually explicated in greater detail in the book. On the first question is, well, how do we move in this direction? I'm not a political strategist, so I don't have like some brilliant short-term political strategy for the Biden administration or really for anybody else in this book. But I do emphasize a couple of points on feasibility. First, even if it might not be possible at any time in the future to fully realize all of the ideas in this book, there's lots of room for incremental improvement, both on internal migration and on the international kind. Maybe we can't get to full open borders, but if the United States or other advanced democracies, say, take 10% more immigrants per year than they currently do, that's hundreds of thousands of people that can live in greater freedom and prosperity than before. That's just a huge gain. A similar story can be told about breaking down barriers to internal freedom of movement. Maybe we can't decentralize power as much as I would like, but we can certainly do some incremental decentralization on various issues that would empower more people to make choices to vote with their feet. Maybe we can't completely get rid of all barriers to internal migration. But if we cut down on things like exclusionary zoning at the margin, that too can free up many thousands of people, and it can do so very quickly. And on almost every other issue that I've mentioned here too, incremental reforms are very feasible. And even a 5 or a 10% improvement relative to the status quo, again, still will massively benefit tens of thousands or hundreds of people, and also will make society wealthier. And you could even get a positive feedback loop. The more economic growth we have, the more wealth people have, the more they may be open to more tolerance of outsiders and the like. There's a lot of historical evidence suggesting that. The second point that I would make, and this is discussed in the conclusion of the book, is that there are some trends that are moving in the right direction that can be taken advantage of. Survey data in both the US and in many European countries shows that younger and more highly educated people are more supportive of immigration than older and less educated people are. Most are not as supportive as I am, I readily grant that, but they're more supportive than the status quo or than their parents or grandparents, and we can take advantage of that trend. And finally, this is not in the book, but I've written about it elsewhere. I can send a link to it to anybody who's interested in it. I think we can learn from the lessons of the struggles against racism and homophobia and other similar prejudices that over time, people came to realize that racism was wrong, that slavery was wrong, that the oppression of gays and lesbians was wrong, because people of a different race or gays and lesbians and so forth were fundamentally similar and fundamentally entitled to the same rights as in one case white people, in the other case straight people and so forth. And we also came to recognize that race and to a large extent, sexual orientation are ultimately morally arbitrary characteristics that is not something we can, for the most part, can control, and it's not something that determines our moral worth and how much freedom we should be entitled to. And if people can over time realize that about race, I can also add gender here, sexual orientation, and so on, then they should also be able to realize it about who your parents are and where you were born. Where you were born relative to a line on a map, or what ethnic group your parents belong to, and so on. That's just as morally arbitrary as whether you're white or black, whether you're male or female, whether you're gay or straight, and so forth. And those movements, when they were successful, this is the point that they were successful in stressing, as opposed to trying to argue that they did argue, and they were right to argue that, for instance, ending segregation would be to the economic benefit of white people, or that allowing same-sex marriage would economically benefit the overall society, would trickle down benefits for heterosexuals as well. All of that is true, actually, and it's also true for immigration, but I think it's this moral case which was most successful in making progress. Though I would add, that's not to say that we shouldn't adopt policies to try to alleviate negative side effects. I suggested various possibilities earlier in the talk, but this moral case that has been successful in other struggles for equality and liberty, it's one that I think should be pushed more in this area as well. Oh, and on the race to the bottom, I almost forgot about that. That is addressed in chapter 2 of the book. For those who are not familiar with the theory, the race to bottom idea is the theory that far from states or localities engaging in beneficial competition to attract migrants, what they'll actually do is engage in destructive competition. And in particular, what they'll try to do is attract business interests so that those business interests will pay more taxes, but at the expense of everybody else. So in the classic story, for instance, they'll attract business interests by giving them the opportunity to pollute a lot more than in other states. And if one state allows them to pollute a lot, then other states will have to follow suit. And in the end result, in the worst case scenarios, everything is totally polluted and everywhere is horrible, and the air and water are poison and so forth. And only these narrow business interests are benefiting. And both in this book and in other writings, I take issue with this theory at both an empirical level and a theoretical level. Empirically, the evidence on this just doesn't really check out. It doesn't seem to be the case that states lower environmental or other sort of benefits to the general population in order to attract business interests. To the contrary, actually many forms of environmental protection were actually first pioneered and more effectively done at the state level as opposed to at the national level. And there's good conceptual reasons for why this is true, and that even if you're a state government that cares only about increasing its tax revenue, still, in order to have tax revenue, you need not just businesses, but also workers. And the workers may not want to live in a place which is polluted or which is problematic in all sorts of ways. To the contrary, if they're going to be willing to live there, they would only do so if they can get higher paid there than in areas which are more attractive. And that in turn leads to the point that even business interests will often have incentives to locate in areas which are good for workers, because if the area is a nice place to live, then it will take less money to attract the workers you want there. Whereas if the area is poisoned, polluted, has terrible education, high crime rates, and so forth, good workers will not want to locate there unless you pay them a special premium to do so. On the whole, business interests don't like to pay special premiums if they can avoid it. So therefore, many of them have interests which are actually in common with those of other foot voters rather than against them. I don't claim that there are never harmful races to the bottom. There are a few areas where perhaps they exist. One example may be sports team stadium issues, where occasionally cities engage in destructive competition to offer more stadium subsidies for NFL teams and the like, even though, by the way, the evidence suggests that it doesn't even increase overall tax revenue or overall benefits to local economy. But on the whole, the problem of racist to bottom is overblown. And in the rare cases where it exists, I think the proper solution is sort of narrowly targeted remedies, such as forbidding government subsidies for sports stadiums, as opposed to broad-based centralization of government policy.
Okay, thank you so much. I wrote a couple footnotes for Bruce Ackerman too. He spent a couple years at another law school, earlier in his career. So uh,
Yeah, we Yale graduates try not to think about that.
right. So I have a question. I'm going to put it in the chat, so maybe you could access the chat, but I'll also read it.
Sure.
Sure. So international migration is increasing exponentially because of climate change, as well as various political issues. But the wealthy countries cannot deal with the incredible amounts that will increase as climate change destroys more and more countries. The U.S. takes in very few of the enormous numbers now emigrating, and increase their amounts. But is there a limit to the numbers that can be absorbed?
So I think there's really two questions there. One about climate change specifically, the other about numbers that can be absorbed more generally, whether for climate change reasons or others. On the climate change point, it simply isn't true that it's leading to an exponential increase in international migration, or even that there's an exponential increase in general, whether caused by climate change or something else. You can argue maybe in the future climate change would cause such an exponential increase, but it certainly has not done so far. In the book, I do have a section in chapter 6 devoted to environmental impacts of migration, where I point out two things. One is, as a general rule, wealthier societies have greater ability to control pollution and other kinds of environmental damage. And to the extent that free migration makes the world wealthier, it actually improves our ability to address both climate change and other kinds of environmental problems. To the extent that there are claims that some kinds of migration could exacerbate climate change by, for instance, increasing the use of fossil fuel, the reasonable approach to that is a keyhole solution, and really one that should be done anyway, which is economists will generally agree that to the extent that there is a way to address climate change is through specifically targeted carbon taxes, just tax the specific emissions which cause the climate change, as opposed to trying to control other aspects of people's lives like migration. On the issue of how many people can we absorb generally, I think the answer is obviously there's not a definitive answer to that question, but I think the answer is that to a large extent we can rely on markets and civil society to do that, just as we do for internal freedom of movement, and the extra wealth generated by increased migration increases our absorption capacity. So once we think of absorption capacity not as a zero-sum game where people come in and eat up some of the resources that are already there, but instead think of it as a positive sum game that creates tremendous new wealth, then the question we should be asking is not how can we afford to absorb more people, but rather how can we afford not to? How can we pass up what economist Michael Clemens famously called the $1 trillion bills that are just lying on the sidewalks? That is, free migration is like $1 trillion bill that current government policy chooses not to pick up. And if we did pick it up, not only our absorption capacity, but our capacity to solve all sorts of other problems would be much greater than it is now. Michael, I cannot hear you. It sounds like you're muted.
Sorry. I'll never get the hang of this. There's another question in the chat, Professor Somin, and I think this is about a clarification of the race to the bottom idea. Like, why would a government allow more pollution than it, or any other negative
Yeah. So is this a question about why would people even think to begin with that a race to the bottom could occur? Is that the question?
Yeah, it seems so. It's not.
Okay. So I will try to.
Crime rates fits with the pollution, but I think it's a race to the bottom question. I'm looking forward to getting.
Yeah. So the idea is that we posit, which is to some extent true, at least, that governments want to increase their tax revenue, and businesses are a good source of tax revenue, and businesses, particularly at least ones that engage in polluting activities, they might be attracted to areas where there are fewer restrictions on pollution, and therefore one way to attract in those businesses is to reduce controls on pollution, so you can get them in, and then they pay money into the government coffers. The government officials are then happy. They have more money that they can spend, and the businesses presumably are happy because it's more profitable due to the fact that they're not facing pollution controls. So that's the theory. For reasons that I mentioned earlier, I don't think this theory holds up, at least not in most cases, but that's the idea.
Would that include right-to-work laws that keep wages lower and make it harder to organize unions?
Yes, that is another area where idea is often applied. And there, my response is twofold. It's not clear to me that these kinds of, that preventing right to work laws or promoting unionization actually is good for workers as a whole. It's good for those workers who are actually in the union, but by artificially inflating wages, it reduces the total amount of jobs. It also increases prices for consumers. So it's very questionable that this is actually a race to the bottom as opposed to a more conventional race to the top. That if you look at where people, not just businesses, but actually workers, where they want to move to, it tend to be places where there are more job opportunities, which actually on average tend to be places with relatively lower labor regulation than others. You can say the same thing about the $15 minimum wage or other high minimum wages. There's a story that you have to have a federal minimum wage to prevent states from lowering the minimum wage too low. But I think this ignores the basic economic insight that the real minimum wage is always zero. That is the amount of money earned by those who aren't employed in the first place. And if you raise the minimum wage above the level at which it's profitable to hire the workers in question, then a lot fewer of them will be hired, or they will get lower benefits of other kinds, non-wage benefits or some combination of both, and prices to consumers will be higher, which again tends to disproportionately affect the poor. If somebody in my income class has to pay 10 or 20% more at a restaurant or at the supermarket or at Walmart, I will complain about it, but it won't affect my lifestyle that much. Whereas if a working or lower middle class person ends up in that situation, obviously it's worse for them.
Thank you. My colleagues and I belong to a union, and we enjoy our monopoly status. So,
in a certain sense, I do too. I'm a member of the bar, but it's not a union as such, but it is a government organized cartel, very beneficial to lawyers, not so beneficial to the rest of the public that must pay much higher prices for legal services as a result.
Another question. Yeah, would you say, this is interesting. I mean, I found it interesting that I thought it was just maybe a strategy of explication that you set it up initially as a contest between ballot voting and foot voting. There isn't any inherent reason why that would be a strategy of explaining the importance of freedom of movement, but it works. I think it works really well. This question is, would you say ballot box voting creates an illusion of freedom?
It's a good question. I think to some extent it does, that people might have a feeling that their vote matters, even though I won't say it doesn't matter at all, but it matters much less than that feeling might suggest. On the other hand, given that most people do in fact make very little effort to learn about the issues that they vote on, while at one level they may feel the illusion, at another level they do realize that they don't have very much control, because if they did have control, they would take the decision more seriously. But under my approach, I wouldn't abolish ballot box voting entirely. I would just limit and decentralize the powers of government, but people could still vote at the ballot box, and to the extent that they get psychological benefits from that, or that they feel like their views have been heard. And I don't trivialize that. I think that does matter somewhat, in that in a reasonably well-functioning society, we do want a situation where most people feel like there's a sense that their views can be heard, perhaps even though sometimes the reality is very much otherwise. So the fact that politicians at least have to give the impression that they care about the views of individual voters, even though in reality many of the politicians perhaps don't, that is to some extent a good thing. But we can have that good thing while also having greatly expanded foot voting, And while we can have both simultaneously to some degree, we need to limit the domain of ballot box voting, or at least to limit the range of issues controlled by it, so that more issues can be controlled by foot voting. That's where there really is a trade-off, though there is, as I discuss in the book, some complementarity between the two as well.
Okay, thank you. I'm not seeing further questions, so maybe I'll buy a little time with one more. Is there a danger of undermining people's sense of social solidarity or collective? You mentioned the Scandinavian countries, and like I might foot vote to Sweden to have a much more robust public sector and public space, just the public benefits of living in a society. But they all register much higher on measures of social solidarity than we do. And if people actually sort into these structures and live and have their lived experience in them, is there something, are these just different in kind, the political, the polis versus the market, in other words?
There's another issue that I take up to some degree in chapter 6 of the book. Some people worry that migration or immigration of people from different cultures might diminish social trust, which could also diminish social solidarity as well, because people may be more willing to trust those who are similar to them in background and culture than those who are different. What I note in the book is a couple of things on this. One is that it seems like the potential negative effects of immigration on trust are greatly overblown, and that to the extent that there are negative effects, they're much smaller than is often posited. A second point is that it's not clear that more trust and solidarity are necessarily better. Lots of awful things have been done as a result of nationalistic social solidarity. I don't need to even cite the most extreme cases like fascism to make that point. So maybe there's an optimal level of social trust, and if so, that even further strengthens the case for migration, because if it lowers it a bit at the margin but doesn't completely destroy social trust, maybe that's actually a good thing. Finally, there is a related concern, which is distinct but related, which is that if people move around easily, they might not really invest in the communities where they're in, so say, well, I can always just leave. And this is a famous worry associated with the great economist Albert Hirschman, who passed away a year or two ago, and he raised it in his classic book, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. So he fears, for instance, if people can just easily leave an institution when they're dissatisfied, then they won't invest in the institution. They'll just pick up and leave, and things will deteriorate. And I think my answer to concerns like this is that if people have freedom of choice, they can more easily find institutions and communities which fit their preferences and needs well. And if there's a good fit, people are actually more likely to invest and to do a good job of promoting the institution. And if the fit is bad and they're dissatisfied in many ways, in the book I cite various lines of research which tie into this, but one interesting example is that the same kind of argument used to be made for arranged marriages over freedom of choice in marriage, and also for making it difficult or impossible to divorce. The concern is that if you can marry who you want, you don't have the incentive to invest in the person that's actually immediately available. If you can get divorced more easily, you won't invest in a marriage. In reality, social science data shows that when arranged marriage gives way to freedom of choice in marriage, people actually invest more in the marital relationship than they would otherwise. And similarly, the possibility of divorce, while not always a great thing, it does incentivize people to not take the partner for granted, right? That if you know the other person has no options at all, then you're more likely to abuse the relationship than if you don't. I'm not saying that living in a political jurisdiction is exactly like a marriage, and there's lines of evidence that I note that are more specific to political jurisdictions, including that smaller communities or smaller suburbs in the US often have better investment in social institutions than bigger ones, even though the smaller ones, there are more foot voting options because it's easier and cheaper to move to another suburb in the same area than it is to move to another state. or even another city or another metropolitan area entirely. So far from mobility being at odds with trust and community, in some ways it can actually build it by creating better matches between people and the communities that they live in. If you have the bad luck to be born in a community that doesn't fit your needs well and is a poor match, you can find one that is a better match, just like greater freedom of choice in terms of who you can marry. That increases the likelihood that you will find somebody who is, the right person for you. I won't claim that you will find the ideal person for you out of all the billions of people in the world, but you may perhaps find somebody who meets that ideal more than if your marital options are confined to a narrow group, or even worse, if they're essentially arranged for you and you have no choice at all.
Okay, thank you. There are a couple more questions, but
Sure.
I think one is asking you to reiterate your point about keyhole solutions to problems if they in fact exist. So we've recorded this. Then someone else wants to know about the other books you've published, and I'll make everyone aware again that you have several earlier books that are well worth it.
If you Google me, you can quickly find my website, which has links to all of my books and many of my articles, both academic and popular as well.
Right, and I forgot to mention that you've actually done a lot of public work, publicly accessible popular writing in political magazines and op-eds and the like. So this is actually an interesting question. Free migration means through legal process. And this person is saying, I went through hardships, to do this legally. And this is something I hear a lot, that there's concern about following the laws that we have until the laws are changed. I take it you're advocating for significant changes in our legal regime with respect to migrants.
Yes, the point of this book is to argue that many of the currently existing laws in migration, both internal and international, are actually unjust and should be abolished. There's a separate issue of, so long as they are not abolished, do people have an obligation to continue to following them? I have elsewhere, not in this book, but elsewhere, argued that in many cases, people do not have an obligation to follow deeply unjust laws if the injustice is great enough. But you can disagree with me on that and still agree with me with what I say in this book. If you're interested in more of my thoughts on this issue, I did a piece just a couple months ago entitled the I'm for Legal Immigration Dodge, where I addressed the point that in debates over immigration, a lot of people say, well, I'm not against immigration, I'm just for legal immigration. I think this misses the point, much of the point of what the actual debate is about, because the actual debate is about whether the current laws are wise and just. So to say that I'm for legal immigration is a little bit like saying in a debate over marijuana legalization, I'm for legal marijuana, right? I'm just against the illegal kind. That misses the point that what the debate is actually about is whether marijuana should be illegal in the first place or not.
Okay.
I just put in the chat a link to that piece.
Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna make a little copy of that. Okay, I think our guest has been very kind and very patient with us and has taken a good deal of his time, and he's provided a great deal of illumination on a range of issues tonight. So Professor Somin, we thank you. We're so glad that you were willing to do this and help us here. I'm going to send you notice about the next two book talks. So the next talk is March 18th with James Marone of Brown University. It's going to talk about his new book, The Republic of Wrath, about polarization over the course of American political development. And we have another event on March 24th with CUNY Graduate Center sociologist and legal scholar Julie Suck, who has a book about women's activism historically in support of the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. But Professor Somin, this was marvelous. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you so
Ilya.
much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great. It was great, and you asked many great questions.
Okay, great. You take good care now and be well. Okay.
Thank you.
I'm going to end the meeting, everyone. Good night.
Bye, Ilya.
Good night. Thank you again. Michael, if you like, you can send those interested a link to my website, which is actually in the signature to my emails that you've gotten a number of.
Yes, I will. I'll have a list here. So there's a, Zoom registers the email. We ask people for their emails. So I will do that. And I'm looking forward to working through your book. It's really marvelous work. Everyone, the Clue credit's automatic. If you're asking me about Clue, I will take care of that. It's done. So, all right. And maybe we could compare notes on Bruce Ackerman sometime. He would remember.
Yeah,
probably wouldn't remember.
We're still in touch. I think his view on this book is that he agrees with a lot of the international migration part, but disagrees with a high percentage of the rest.
Of course, but
we're still friends, and there are other issues where we have common ground, even though obviously not entirely here. I once asked him whether of his students I was the one who was most ideologically at odds with him, and he was like, well, not even close, that he certainly had others that were more so. Like, I'm trying to remember like he mentioned that Chris Kobach is one of his former students, and obviously Bruce Ackerman and I are like peas in a pod compared to Chris Kobach and Ackerman, or Chris Kobach and me for that matter.
Yeah, I wasn't that serious a law student, to be honest with you, but I think I was somewhere in the socialist Marxist ambit back then. So, but I did do a semester or two of work with. I took 2 semesters with him. He was working on the 3-volume work at the time. The Storrs lectures had just come out, so guy's brilliant and like.
So this was in the early '90s that you had him.
Early '80s.
Early '80s. Wow.
Well, 80, 83, 84.
Yeah, I was 97 to 2000.
Well, I know. Yeah, great. Okay, very nice to meet you.
Well, I'll tell him you said hello next time I.
Well, I'd be curious. He might remember. He might not. So, but sure, if you're in touch with him, that'd be interesting.
Yeah, he and I are in touch. I don't know, probably once a month or something. It's depending on the situation.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Again.
Thank you again. Thank you so much for organizing this. I look forward to seeing the video.
Yeah, and I'll send you some paperwork soon. I'm sorry I neglected that, but I'll get to that.
Yeah, soon. I don't remember if there's an honorarium or not, but if there is,
absolutely there is. It's not a huge one, but yes, there is, and I'll send you the information and just 2 1-pagers.
Now that you're committed to paying it, I would admit that I would have done it for free, but obviously,
no.
Doing it for pay is even better.
No, here, it's a gesture, and we're really happy to do it. So
thank you again. I have to go help put 2 little kids to bed, but thank you again for having me.
Great. All right. Good night.
Night. Bye.